Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Catherine. Catherine, welcome to the show. Thank you for making time for us today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So could you introduce yourself to the listeners, please, Catherine?
Yes, absolutely. I'm a clinical and forensic psychologist in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I'm also an EMDR therapist and somatic experiencing practitioner and the founder of the Ottawa Centre for Resilience, which is a mental health center for childhood trauma and dissociation, attachment, adoption, and high conflict families in the Ottawa area.
Wow. Busy, highly qualified, highly experienced professional. Love it.
Yeah.
Is there any personal connection to the adoption world, or is it purely professional? Just because sometimes my listeners like to know.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say it's a mixture, but it wasn't a personal experience that brought me into doing that work. I think my path was more through focusing on trauma and families. And then that sort of connected me to working to kids involved in our child protection, child welfare system, and some of who fortunately do go on to adoption. So I think that was sort of the path to doing more adoptive work.
And when we had the conversation last month or so, I think it was, it started this month, we were talking about this common challenge that parents have of, and they've got an issue presenting with their child, and they're thinking, is this adoption related, or isn't it? And that was kind of our hopping off point for our conversation today. So why is that important, do you think?
So I think when we were talking about it, I shared this, but I'll sort of go back into it, is that at least in my work, I see people kind of right across the spectrum, where you have some people where that identity as being an adoptee or being an adoptive family or parents is very strong and very important. And there's a lot of sense of recognition and belonging with that identity. And so when they're seeing issues when those types of adoptive parents are seeing issues presenting in their adopted child, it's being seen from that perspective and lens. So there's a sense of feeling that they really want to work with mental health professionals who understand adoption and how it can impact families and children. And there sometimes could be an over tendency to feel that everything is adoption connected. So I would say that would be one end of the spectrum. And as a mental health professional who has a professional identity as working with that community, I see that would definitely be a good chunk of folks that come to my office. But I see people right, on the other end of the spectrum where they don't even consider adoption, and there's a thought that would never be connected to anything. And they won't even disclose it, so much so because they don't think it's connected. So I might not discover until 6 months down the road in working with a kid and a family that there's an adoption history, because nobody thought to mention it or that it would be relevant. I would probably say, like with most good things in life, I think maybe the ideal would be to find some kind of a balanced middle ground, where we're open to, could this be adoption related in part or a little bit or all, or does it have to be, or is it just normal development, or is it something else? And that, like, they're all possibilities, right? And that it depends.
Yeah. And why is it important to pinpoint it? I mean, as I'm asking this question, I'm thinking, is this a slightly silly question to ask? But somebody told me a while ago, there's no such thing as silly questions.
Right.
Why is it important to know whether this is an adoption issue or a child issue?
That's a good question. So I think for myself as a mental health practitioner, it's helpful to know because it informs the work I'm going to do and what kind of how I'm going to help the clients understand what's going on. And a lot of what we are doing for clients is supporting them to organize and make sense of their story and their experience. And you know, we don't get it right away. And so often you're trying on different hats and like, is this a good fit or is this a good fit? And so it's helpful to be able to include the adoption piece and even just for exploration, like where does that fit for you in all of this? I think it's helpful for a family to know that in terms of, I guess, in part seeking services and feeling like they're going to find someone, you know, who would be able to work with them in that way, or that who knows that and knows how to understand, you know, adoption specific issues, so that if that is part of the picture, they'll recognize them. Because if you work with someone who doesn't have that lens, they'll miss it because they don't know what to look for.
Yeah. So clearly, as a therapist, the whole therapy thing is an experience. It's an experiential thing. It's to do with you and your client, or you and your clients in a room going through the process. You know, you talked about EMDR and somatic therapy. So there's a limit, because we're just two people having a chat on a podcast, and we're trying to share educational, useful content with adoptive parents listening. So given that this isn't a therapy session, it's an educational session.
Yeah.
What would be the most useful things that you could share with adoptive parents listening in terms of helping their kids thrive?
Well, that's a pretty huge question.
It is, isn't it?
So, I mean, in a lot of ways, I don't think that I would say it's different than what you would say for any parents in terms of wanting to, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all good parenting and relationships. So, I mean, when we talk about parenting today, you know, I think our thinking has come a ways about, you know, of course, every generation, you know, it shifts, and sometimes we go a little more rigid and a little more flexible, and, you know, every generation thinks the next generation's doing it all wrong.
Yeah.
Right. I'd like to think that we continue to move generally forward, that we get sort of a little more reflective and intelligent about what we know about parenting. So I think what we know these days is that you really need to have a balance between being warm and nurturing and engaging with your children, and being structured and challenging them, and and that you really need to be able to try to do all of those components, because if you have some and not others, you can see how that could, you know, if you're very structured and challenging with a child, but there's no nurture, that can veer towards being, you know, mean and controlling, and that's not good. But if you're only about nurture and warmth, as much lovely as that is, it also creates problems, right, with over permissiveness. So I think in parenting, in a perfect world, I like the expression, and I can't remember where this comes from, but the idea of being like that your children would say that you were tough but fair and loving, if that makes sense. And the other thing I'm going to say right away, because as soon as I start talking about parenting, I always worry that everyone's feeling like crap listening, because parenting's so hard and you feel like, oh, that's nice, but who can do that all the time? So the good news is you really don't have to be able to strike that balance and be able to do all those 4 components really well all the time. So one thing that's really clear and unequivocal in parenting research is that you just need to be good enough. And what that actually means is 30% of the time, like 30% of the time you get it, you're attuned to your child, you receive them, you meet their needs. And if you miss the boat a little bit, the other 70% of the time, your kid's going to be just fine.
Yeah.
So 30%, I feel like most of us can hit 30%. So it's like, let yourself off the hook. You lose your patience, you're not in the mood for a cuddle because you've had a long day, whatever. Just put that in your 70% bucket and just move on. You know, like you have all day to hit 30%, and like that suddenly feels a little more manageable, right?
Yeah. So if you're wondering, I think I might be at 29% rather than 30%. That's another clue. That's another clue that you're thinking might be a bit off. I had an email over the weekend from a prospective adoptive parent, okay, and she was she's gone into a support group on Facebook, and been trauma bombed.
In terms of what everyone else was talking about.
Yeah. So everybody was
Yeah.
you know, somebody I was talking to a couple of weeks ago talked about trauma dumping, which is
Sure.
I thought that was a great phrase. You know, people go into Facebook groups to dump and share their trauma, and somehow that seems to be
definitely there are groups like that. Yes.
Yeah. So this prospective adoptive mum had been trauma bombed, which is slightly different. So she'd gone in asking for help or hoping for encouragement, and all she'd been given was real bad news.
Oh yeah, I know. And you know, that group probably is really has its place for those people who are in a bad place, and they need that, right? They need to be able to talk to each other. But it wasn't the right group for her, right? They were in a different life stage than she was.
But it said that she said that she'd felt depressed by what happened. And this got me thinking, well, what if this is happening to adoptive parents? Because she's at this stage, she's a prospective adoptive parent. What if the trauma stories, you know, because I sometimes, you know, I see we talk a lot about trauma. There's a lot of talk about trauma. What about all the stories of trauma are actually taking adoptive parents down? That's making them depressed. And you know, if you're coming from it, you're not going to be in the best place to parent if you're coming from that place, are you?
So I think it depends what your experience is and where you are in your adoptive journey, right? So it depends on, you know, if you're parenting traumatized kids with traumatized nervous systems, it can be traumatizing to you, and so it's really helpful. And you often, what I hear a lot from adoptive parents in those positions who've been struggling, kind of, they feel in secret and in silence for years, is they don't feel believed, they feel ashamed. And so they really need a place, a peer group, not with professionals, you know, they can find professionals to talk to, but other parents who have similar experiences where they feel validated, right? Where they can talk about the crazy stuff happening in their home and how they're doing. So I think those groups are important for certain people, and they need them. But, you know, when you're a prospective parent, that's like they're in totally different places in their adoptive journey, right? So like I wouldn't want to take, what I'm trying to say is I wouldn't want to take away that group for those people who are finding it helpful, right? I think it's important for them. but it wasn't helpful for her, and
Wasn't
which makes a lot of sense. I think there are other ways we can talk about that. I do think that we don't, and you know, it's hard to generalize because practices in preparing parents to adopt are highly variable regionally and so forth, right? So it's hard for me to say what's happening where. I can say in my own experience working with parents, a lot of the parents I work with don't feel like they were properly prepared for what it would be like really what it would be like day in, day out over a lifetime to parent a traumatized child.
So if you're listening and you don't think you were prepared, then you're not, you are not alone.
No.
You are.
And I think to some extent you can't really prepare, because it's kind of an intellectual exercise before you really do it, right?
Yeah.
Like we can talk and talk and talk about it. And I can tell you, listen, this is what it's like. Or she could, you can go and listen to other people's stories. And you think you kind of get it and you'll kind of, but it's a bit in a sense like reading a novel or watching a movie, right? Where you're like, you dip your toe in and you're like, oh, but I can kind of see what that's like. But I still have access to all my resilience and resources psychologically that I can kind of come back together. But the reality of living that 24/7 over years and years and years, I don't know that there's anything else we can do to really convey to someone what that would be like before you do it.
And I guess the question for me is, is dwelling on feeling unprepared, is that really going to help us move forward? It's
right.
It's not really.
Well, I was just going to say, because some people come to adoption having been biological parents first, and some people just become parents through adoption only. And to those parents, I would like to say, you never feel prepared to be a parent, like biological, adoptive, whatever. So people who have children biologically are scared shitless. You never are like, okay, I'm 100% ready for this. I know what this is going to be. And so I just want to reassure people whose journey to parenthood is through adoption, because I find often those parents really second guess themselves a lot and think, well, maybe this wouldn't have happened, or they wouldn't have felt like this, or they would have been better parents if it was through, a biological route. It's not true. Everybody feels unprepared to be a parent and scared, and everyone feels like a bad parent along the way. And everyone's kid says, you're not a good parent, I hate you, at some point along the way. And it doesn't mean you're not the right person to parent that child.
Yeah. The thing that popped into it's this expectations and surprises and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that popped into my head, so I'm kind of mentoring a guy who's setting up his a business at the moment, and he was going, well, he's employed, and so he's used to that routine. He's been employed, I don't know, 7 years or something, and he said, well, it's one business, 1 minute it's like this and the next minute it's like that. I said, that's business. So in 1 minute I'm totally overwhelmed. It's an emotional roller coaster. 1 minute I'm feeling fine and it's all going great. Next, it's the end of the world. And I said, well, yeah, that's what running your own business is like. You don't have that. You don't have that. He works in a swimming pool, right? So he has occasionally busy times at the swimming pool, and I guess they've had COVID to deal with and but he's more able to switch off outside of that. The ups and downs are going to be lower.
Yes. No, running. I can relate as a business owner. Yeah, running your own business is unpredictable. You just, and you, it's a great choice of analogy, because you're right. It is a lot like parenting, where you're like, I've got it. I've just figured it out. We're good. Everything's running. It's smooth. We've got it. And then something happens, right? Well, parenting's like that, whether it's through adoption or not, right? Where it's like, you just figure out your kids, whatever eatings, when they're little, it's like you just figure out a routine that seems to work with naps and sleeping and eating and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, oh, yes. And then there's a little developmental milestone, a few new neurons connect for the kid, and it's all, you have to start all over again.
Yeah.
And then again, and then again.
And then again. And the other thing that I'm spotting in my own little story here is that I do sometimes talk about the fact that my business degree was a completely waste of time.
Like it didn't prepare you for that, right?
Like it didn't prepare me for it.
Yeah.
That it was, but like economic and social history, what use is that to run a business? But do I'm just thinking, because I said earlier on, talking about how the fact that we weren't prepared is a waste of time. And then I've realized that I actually do that. I sometimes do that with the business.
Yeah.
Right? So I
Sure.
can't waste the thing. So don't beat yourself up if you are beating yourself up for not having prepared.
And because I think like business, becoming a parent, like you can only prepare so much, right? At some point you just have to jump. You just have to go for it and start swimming the best you can.
What's to say, you can't learn to ride a bicycle on a seminar.
No.
It is an on-the-job learning job.
Yeah. And it's a marathon. It's a lifelong marathon. Like once you're a parent for life, and it'll change but it'll never stop.
So do you see parents getting very down about their kids and the trauma, and their beating themselves up for their lack of ability to put this stuff right? Do you see that a lot?
I definitely see it. I don't know about a lot. It's definitely common. I think it's important to note that I see people who aren't doing well, right? That's generally why they'll come to see me. So I can't say how representative that is of the adoption community, because I think the people who are doing well aren't coming into my office, right?
Or listening to this podcast, maybe.
Perhaps, right? They're just living their lives, so which is great.
Yeah.
Yes, I think sometimes adoption and practices around adoption have changed a lot in the last 20 to 30 years. They've moved away from the idea of closed adoptions quite a bit, and there's a lot more openness these days in adoptions. So parents are not necessarily coming in as blind as they used to be to the history of the children that are becoming part of their family. So I think that that's helpful, to not be totally blindsided. I think sometimes where we're still seeing that more so is with international adoptions, where children are being adopted from other countries with different practices that aren't always maybe super transparent, or that it's not really always clear, like that people aren't really talking to parents about what does it mean to adopt an older child who's lived in an orphanage and an institution up until now, and what impact might that have, and what might that look like?
Yeah, lots of small layers of complexity.
It's a lot of layers, yeah. And even a good, and there's a whole range of, institution. What does that mean, right? Having been in an institution.
Yeah. Because
was it Romania? There is a country that was moving to decommission and get rid of all of them. I feel like it was Romania after all that stuff that happened.
Yeah.
A while back. I can't remember though.
Yeah. So, what would you say to a parent who is struggling at this point, whose um, child's struggling, and that struggle from the child is causing the parent to struggle more, and this trauma hole seems to be getting darker and darker? What would you say to them?
So, I mean, I think a few things. I mean, you have to find support for yourself. And that can be a lot of different things. For some people, that could be having a therapist who understands these issues that you can speak with, both about how to parent your child, but also about just what, the secondary trauma that you're experiencing and what it's like for you, and all the conflicting emotions that can come with that. It can bring up a lot of grief and loss around what you thought it was going to be like to be a parent when you were waiting to become a parent, and then how different sometimes the reality ends up being. You had mentioned group, like, I think there's a lot of value for some people in peer support groups, but they're not for everyone, right? And there's a lot of different ones. So sometimes you need to shop around a bit and find a peer community that, is a fit and speaks to you. And now with, so many things being virtual and online, the nice thing is it's a lot easier to do that, to access online communities through social media and so forth.
Yeah.
And finding, I think, a good mental health practitioner who can, help your child, help your family. There's different approaches that are helpful.
Yeah.
Um,
what advice would you give to you've talked about shopping around for peer support groups. I a while ago was shopping around for therapists and ended up with what I thought was a local therapist to me, and the ones around here were a very weird bunch. What advice would you give in terms of how a parent can find the right therapist for them, or the right mental health practitioner for that, or therapist for the kid? What's useful? What are maybe some useful questions that they should ask, some useful considerations? What, other than just going for a gut feel and whether they seem like a nice person or not?
Yeah, and not to diminish that that's important too, that I think it's really important that you feel you have a warm, genuine, comfortable connection with someone you're going to work with. Because we do know that the therapeutic alliance and the strength of the therapeutic alliance, so that's the relationship between the clients and the therapist, is responsible for at least 50% of the change that happens in therapy, if not more. The research kind of, as the research in that area continues to happen, that number seems to keep going up and up, interestingly. So that's important. But I also think that there are some other things that are important. So I would want to ask questions about what's their experience in working in the area of adoption, and and I might get, depending on how picky you want to be or important, I might get really specific, because you might ask someone, oh, do you have experience in adoption? And they go, oh yes. Well, what does that mean? I might just ask them, like, how frequently do you treat members of an adoption constellation, right? And who do you treat? And is that a regular part of your practice? Is that always a part of your caseload, or have you seen one or two throughout your career? Because there's a difference, right? And I think you would want someone who hasn't maybe seen some people where adoption is an issue by accident because it's kind of come in, versus someone who's actually got some real understanding in that area. I would also ask them about trauma and attachment, because those are an important consideration as well. And I would ask what approaches they use and why, right? Like actually ask them to name, to see if they're trained in any evidence-based trauma and attachment approaches. And some of the ones we know in particular that can be really helpful with adoption, if you're dealing with, children, is Theraplay, for example. Not that everyone has to be trained that, but like that's a well-established, well-researched approach, and we know it can be really helpful. So, I think you want to have a little bit of research, a little sheet where you've got, I want the person I'm going to work with to have a clue where we're going here, right? And know something about it. Do they know about the 7 core issues in adoption, like some kind of key terms?
Yeah. So yeah, I think that having having some questions ready would be would be really useful. So you might even Google questions to ask an adoption therapist or something like that, because you might, like we're talking here now, but it might just be it might prompt you some,
So yeah, I mean, I'm giving some general ideas, but then also there might be ones that are particular, then there might be particular issues that are important to you that you want to put in. Also, what you can look for, so I know, for example, here in Ontario, we have a provincial adoption council. We have the Ontario Adoption Council, and they maintain a list of mental health practitioners who have been trained. They offer a training, for example, in working with these families, and so they maintain a list of adoption aware, adoption trained practitioners. So I don't know if lists like that exist in other areas, but that's something to look for. And if you are part of a peer community, word of mouth is brilliant, right? It's often the most useful, I find.
Yeah. I want to go back to the warm and genuine relationship bit, because you were right to pull me up on that. Actually, that's what I found was really weird with all the people that I spoke to, the therapists that I spoke to around here. In fact, that I felt that they were very closed. They weren't open. It's not. So I asked them, so what will our process look like? And they couldn't answer that question. What if we work together? What will our process look like? And they couldn't answer that question.
Well, that's concerning. Yeah,
it is.
I think you want someone who, not maybe someone who can answer all your questions, but someone who's not defensive, someone you can have a dialogue with, right?
Yeah. And another woman in particular said, well, it's not appropriate for me to, I'm involved in adoption, but it's not appropriate for me to say. And I thought, this is a bit of a weird one. You're expecting me to be open with you, and you're not going to be prepared to open with me. And then another one, I said, well, can you give me some examples of people that you've worked with and the outcomes that you've had? And said, well, it wouldn't be appropriate client confidentiality. And I just thought, I'm not asking you to name them, give me their email address.
No, you can speak in general terms, sure.
But each time I asked the question, she was batting it back, and I felt
that was obviously not a good fit for you. Right?
That's a very polite way of putting it. Thank you.
So you should not talk yourself into seeing people that aren't a good fit for you, even if they're highly recommended or very well qualified. Like, I'm not the right therapist for everyone, and I shouldn't be. I mean, because what therapy is really about is relationship, right? And so we're gonna be a better fit for different people.
Yeah.
And that's super important.
Yeah. So I love the idea of getting some peer recommendations or some approved, start with a list rather than Google. Start with a list where people have already done some of the work for you in terms of accredited, approved. Use your networks. Have some questions. And the thing that's popping into my head is, oh, as soon as I think of adding the question, it's like my temptation would be, oh, this would be so much easier if it was done on an email. Why I can find these people out, I can ping these things. That's not going to give you the warmth of and the follow-up of response.
Sure. I mean, maybe if you're really trying to, if you're starting with a big list, you might start with an email to wean down to a shorter list, and then you want to make the in-person contacts.
Yeah.
In our center, we do free, 30-minute we call them intake or consult calls to anyone looking for services, so that we can determine what they're looking for and if that's something we have to offer, or if they do better going somewhere else. And I think that most people do that. And I think it's okay to know what's important to you, and that might be idiosyncratic, and that's okay, right? But sometimes getting a young, not very experienced therapist that is really warm and open and curious and is a good personality fit for you will be a better choice than getting the seasoned, therapist of 40 years.
Yeah.
So, because so much is about the safety and connection in the relationship.
Yeah. So what does the process look like, or how does the process differ if we're talking about getting a therapist for our child?
I don't think it differs too much, but of course there's going to be the added element of the fit between the child and the therapist. And I mean, really, parents should have, in a perfect world, parents will have some involvement in that work. And so now you've got to find a fit between, if you're a 2-parent family and a child, then it's like you've got to find someone who can fit for all of you, right?
Yeah.
And do that and maintain the balance between, supporting multiple people in a family unit.
Yeah. How do you, on a broader question, how do you see this? How do you see that? I mean, how do you see this kind of working with the child, working with the parent, working with the family, empowering the parent to work with the child? These are very big issues. I don't know. Help the parent navigate that, because
what should the parents expect in terms of how that will look? Or
so I'm aware, some people say, well, actually, you're with the child far more than the therapist, so really it should be about you and
right,
how you are. There's everybody, other than saying everybody's got to find the right mix for each other. What are some of the issues that you see playing out in these, like child only,
okay.
parent only, family?
So my rule is not to have a rule.
Good.
In that, and I would kind of warn people to question therapists who will only work in one way, right? So I think people who say, well, if the child is under a certain age, I'm only going to see the parents, or I'm only going to see you as a family unit, or I'm never going to see, there's all kinds of permutations. In my opinion, a good therapist is going to look at the whole family system, look at the reasons you're coming in now, what's most important, and then also needs to take into consideration, how am I most likely as a therapist to be successful in supporting this family and helping them move? So, for instance, I might have a family with, let's say, a teenage child who's really struggling and could really benefit from therapy, and everyone can see that teenage child would benefit from therapy, but they're not interested, or they're going to be a really long-term project to engage and move. But in the meantime, you've got parents who are available and interested, and so I could move that. I might be able to shift that family system faster and more effectively if I can work with the parents where I don't have all those roadblocks and defensiveness. I can work with them to then do some things differently at home in their relationship with their child. And maybe that's going to be more helpful. Not because it's I'm saying the parents are the issue. So like part of my assessment is what's going on in this family and where's my window in also though, right? Sometimes it's really developmentally appropriate for a teenage child to have private therapy that the parents aren't super involved in. And that might be, what's indicated. So, I mean, and I could go on, you can see there can be kind of almost infinite permutations, but I guess the point is that I think that a good clinician is going to do an assessment of each case that comes in. What are the needs and where can the work be done, and then suggest that, like sort of reflect that back to people coming in. Sometimes you might think the parents really need the work, but they're not going to do it. And so you'll take the kid because at least the kid has a safe place to come.
Yeah. To what extent are parents open and honest with you in this early stages, which is clearly, their openness and honesty is clearly going to be important. Whether they're talking to you or they're talking to somebody here in the UK or in the US or wherever. Sure. The brief that they give you, their openness is their openness when they're talking to prospective therapists or support is going to be key to how good the solution suggested approach that you come up with, and the building the relationship of as you go forward. How open are parents at this stage in your opinion?
So openness to open to sharing information, or open to hearing suggestions for intervention?
I would say probably do the open. Sorry, I'm not asking the question very well.
No, that's okay.
So what I'm saying is that you, at the start of the conversation, you talked about people being on the spectrum where they are, they're closed down, or they're blaming everything on adoption, or they're completely blind to the fact that adoption is an issue.
Right.
And clearly nobody's at that. Most of the people are in the middle.
People are somewhere else. Yeah.
So my question really is how open about their situation are adoptive parents that come to you seeking a solution? Are they open enough? Are most of them sufficiently open enough for you to come up with a recommendation of a plan, or does it depend? What are some of the things that maybe? Sure. What are some of the areas that the parents may be slightly off with in terms of getting the best out of their therapist?
I think as far as like sort of general disclosure of information in the story and why they're coming, I find the far majority of people are quite open. And the way that people tell you that story gives you a lot of information, because it's their understanding of what's not working in their family. I think where I see less openness can be around who has work to do and where does the change need to happen. And often, to be fair, people are often coming at a point where they're pretty exhausted and burnt out, and it's not their first time they've tried to find help or talk to someone or tried something. So it's not unusual that I'll have parents say, we've done enough. Like, we've had so much work, so much intervention focused at us. Like, now it's his turn or her turn. Like, now it's time for our kid to go to therapy and do their work. So that gives you a lot of information about what's not working in that family, right? And where they're at, and that parents are really burning out and feeling like, it's the child that's the issue and the child needs to do the work. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yeah.
So I would say it's unusual. That is a more common, I would say, a more common, one of the most common kind of closed presentations or less open ones would be that, where it's like, the child's the issue, here's the child, fix the child, and we don't want to be involved because it's the child that needs to change who they are or change their behavior.
Yeah.
And I would say, even if you're working with adults, that's never like that. Like, none of us live in a bubble, right? We're all in systems and relationships, and that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, as listeners to the podcast might know, me and my wife haven't got any kids, right? So I find myself, when I'm in the parenting, when we get into parenting kind of things, I think, I don't want to go anywhere near that. But I often, because I'm not experienced to do that, but I often go to think about my analogies. So if I were to say that about my wife, right?
Sure.
if I were to go to a therapist,
get help. She's not okay.
Yeah, if I would go to speak to a therapist, and say, thank you for all your help. I've tried lots of different people, but really it's my wife that needs to see the therapist. Then I can't really see that going very far, that conversation. I would say that I was in severe lack of, I wasn't in a very self-aware place.
Yeah, and couples therapists will tell you, I'm sure, have lots of stories about people showing up like that all the time. I think our history in psychology is sort of this individual treatment model, and I think in particular with children and families, I really don't. I think it's pretty limited. I think, kids live in schools and communities and families, and like, there's so many systems and levels of life intersecting there, right?
Yeah.
That, as an office-based private practitioner, where I can have this one kid come into my office once a week, maybe, like, how much am I influencing those different spheres of existence? And is that really going to create meaningful change, right?
Yeah. Yes. So I like the idea. I like the thing that you said about my rule is I don't have rules. I thought that was really.
I try not to. I try to treat each family as as they come.
That's what we want to be done. We want to be treated as individuals, or individual families, or as family groups, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the craft of what we do as clinicians, is that we know the science and we know the sort of the general theories and what's helpful, but then we tailor it to what's in front of us, right?
Yeah.
And to what people are coming in for. Like, I could look at your family coming in, and I can have a brilliant conceptualization of what's going on and what they need, but it's not aligned with what they're seeing and what they want to work on. And then what, right? So there's some great research on therapy outcomes that has found that, so relationship, the therapeutic relationship, and if the client feels like you are working on the goals they want to be working on, that they're coming in and telling you they want to work on, is what leads to some of the best outcomes, right?
Yeah.
So, because how would that feel to keep coming and saying, Dr. Horvath, I really want to figure out how to get whatever, Johnny to eat his breakfast and get on the school bus on time. And I keep saying, oh, sure, that's nice. Let's talk about family vacation. I don't know. I'm trying to, but it's like, this person isn't listening to me, right?
Yeah, it's like a salesperson trying to sell us a 4x4 when we want a coupe. It's not going to work, is it?
Exactly.
That's interesting, because I did a lot of work in schools, and it wasn't clearly it wasn't therapy. It was group fun activity sessions, helping kids. Yeah. So where I was coming from in the first few sessions that I did in schools, it was about helping the kids be happy. But then I cottoned on fairly quickly because of something that one of the kids said to me. So they said, well, yeah, but I wanted to do this. How do I do that? And then I shifted my whole approach after maybe 3 sessions. So my starting point was asking the kids what they wanted, what was their dream. So they wanted to be a nurse, be a footballer, pass the piano exam, get into the school rugby team. They had a goal, and then the rest of the workshop was based on helping them make their goal a reality.
Yeah, because then you have buy-in, and then they're motivated, right?
Yeah.
So
and that's why I brought that one up, because that's how I did it in that session. So what sort of that buy-in stuff, how do you do that with kids?
Well, I mean, that's part of the art, right? Like, I mean, you have to be responsive. People have to feel like you see them, you get them, and that you care about the same things they care about, right?
Yeah. And
and
what
then
about the parent getting buy-in from the kid to go to therapy?
Yeah, that's a good one. And it really depends. Sometimes you do have kids who are, all you have to say is like, would you like to have someone you can go and talk to about anything you want, and it's private, and she's a nice lady and she's got some cool stuff in her office. And some kids are like, oh, okay, right? Or they'll try it once, and then once they meet you and see, they're sort of like, oh. Whereas you have others that, I mean, I see court mandated, I treat young offenders, so I see kids who definitely don't want to see me. And it's like, you have to meet them where they're at, and you have to respect that. And I'll just say, well, it seems like you're stuck with me. Like, that sucks. So we can sit here in silence for the next 10 sessions. That'll be pretty boring for both of us. Or maybe we can find something to do with our time. It's our time. We can do what we want with it. But, like, since we're stuck with each other, let's see if we can find something that's interesting to you to do with that time.
As you say, all art. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's lots of other tricks, you listen to music and do all kinds of things with the kids, but it's all the skill of it's all about relationship building, right?
That's been fascinating, Catherine. And we didn't know where it was going to go, but I think what we've set out is hopefully some very useful information on the therapist search.
I think as like a closing comment, I would just say, I would sort of encourage parents to find their confidence, to be assertive, to shop around and find, like, that you do know yourself, your family, your kids, what you need and what's a good fit, and that it, like, to go for that, and not to settle, like some of the examples and stories you shared about trying to find different therapists, and like, well, this one I don't feel very good with this one. But sometimes you just feel like, oh, but I was told they were, the best, and everyone else has a wait list, so maybe I should just try this person. I think sort of my closing comment would be fit is really important, and it's worthwhile to hold out for that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm also going to put links in the show notes to your website and your social, so people can get in touch with you. Do you do any work on Zoom, or is it all in person?
Well, yeah, I do. I mean, COVID has dramatically changed the amount of virtual work we're doing. I'm definitely, where we work, the limiting factor is that we're only licensed to provide services to people who are within the jurisdiction we're licensed. So that means within Ontario for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Jolly good. Thank you very much for your time. It's been great chat.
Yeah, thank you for the chat.